Hi everyone, good day. My name is Dr. Renzel Yu and I am an internist. So my topic for this day would be all about the pulmonary physiology. So for my objectives, at the end of this lecture, I hope I would be able to discuss well on the anatomy of the lungs, to discuss on the mechanisms of pulmonary ventilation, to discuss on pulmonary edema, pleural fluid, and pleural effusion, to discuss on the principles of gas exchange, to discuss on the transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide, and finally to discuss on the regulation of respiration. Okay, so let us first talk about the lungs. So the lungs itself is actually not only a solid organ, but also an elastic structure. It is important to note that our lungs itself has no attachments to the thoracic walls, to the walls of the chest cage, to the walls of the chest cage. However, they are suspended at its hilum from the mediastinum. So when I say that it's hilum, take a look at the figure here that is pointed here. Okay, in the middle portion here, all right, in the middle portion here where your bronchi, your left bronchi will project towards the left lung. That is where the hilum is underneath it. Okay, so suspended at its hilum, the lungs are suspended at its hilum from the mediastinum. The mediastinum is the space within the center of our um, thoracic cavity. So instead, the lungs will quote unquote float in the thoracic cavity and is surrounded by a thin layer of pleural fluid. As I will further discuss later, your pleural fluid is important because this serves as a lubricant to facilitate a smooth uh, sliding movement of the lungs whenever it tries to contract, okay, during inhalation and your exhalation. So the main function of our respiration is of course to provide oxygen to the tissues and especially to remove carbon dioxide. Now there are four major components of our respiration. It is composed of the pulmonary ventilation, the diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide between your alveoli and the blood, the transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the blood and body fluids, and finally the regulation of ventilation. Okay, so our lungs, whenever we try to inhale and exhale, right, it expands and contracts in two different ways. First, during inhalation, there is that downward and the upward movement of the diaphragm to lengthen or shorten the chest cavity. There will also be elevation or depression of the ribs in order to increase or decrease the antero-posterior diameter of the chest cavity, as you can see here in the figure. Okay, so during normal quiet movement, okay, when we try to breathe normally, the main muscle that is responsible for the respiration is our diaphragm. Okay, so when we try to inhale, the main muscle responsible for that is the diaphragm. But when we exhale, okay, when we exhale, take note that exhalation itself is a passive process. So we exhale because of the elastic recoil of the lungs, as I will further explain later on. Now, during heavy breathing, okay, take note, if there is heavy breathing, especially during expiration, your abdominal muscles contract further because the elastic recoil itself is not enough to expel the air out. Okay, if there is active breathing or heavy breathing rather. So during inspiration, the antero-posterior thickness of the chest can increase as much as 20% greater during maximum inspiration. Now, all take note that all the muscles that will be discussed, okay, whose functions are to elevate the chest, they are all muscles categorized under muscles for inspiration, whereas all muscles which are responsible for depressing the chest cage are used for expiration. Okay, so there are four types of muscles for inspiration. First, we have your external intercostal muscles, as you can see here on the diagram, your external intercostal muscles, And take note of the arrow where the direction of the pull goes. Okay, so your external intercostal muscles, you have your sternocleidomastoid, which is located here, the one here in our neck. Okay, this allows the pulling of the sternum, upward lifting of the sternum during your inspiration. We also have your anterior serrati or your serratus anterior muscles, okay, which are responsible for elevating the ribs. And finally, the scalenus muscle, which are responsible for elevating the first two ribs. For the muscles for expiration, remember that for expiration, the especially for active respiration, the muscles mainly responsible for it, there will be an additional contribution coming from your abdominal muscles, specifically your rectus abdominis muscles and your internal intercostal muscles. Okay, so We're now done with the initial anatomy of the lungs. We now talk about the different lung pressures. So the first pressure that I'd like to focus on is actually the pleural pressure. So take note of the diagram here, okay, as I will be discussing later on. Okay, so first with the pleural pressure. Your pleural pressure is defined as the pressure of the fluid between the lung pleura and the chest wall pleura. Take note that the pleural pressures are, especially the pressures in the lungs, are usually slightly negative. Okay, and especially with relation to the pleural pressure, it is approximately negative 5 centimeter water of pressure. This is important because your lungs is a closed space. Okay, it's an enclosed. It is an enclosed space. In order to vacuum, okay, just like a vacuum, in order to vacuum air, you need a negative pressure inside in order to pull the air inside. Okay, so this is responsible for the normal suction pressure to keep the lungs open. So during inspiration, take note that the negative pressure will become more negative in order to draw more air. Okay, so as you can see here on the diagram, this is the volume change, whereas it shows the lung volume. Okay, and then this is your transpulmonary pressure. So first, let's start with your inspiration. Remember that in inspiration, the initial slightly negative pressure of approximately negative 5 centimeter water can be more negative, reaching to more at negative 7 centimeter water here. If the pressure becomes more negative, as you can see here on the volume change, the lung volume increases. Okay, so that's how it is interpreted in the graph. Now, for the alveolar pressure, your alveolar pressure is the pressure that is inside our lung alveoli. So when there is no air flowing into or outside of the lungs, the pressure is 0 centimeter water. But during inspiration, it will again be more negative. So this time it will only be negative 1 centimeter water. But on expiration, in order to push the air out, you need your pressure to be positive. So that is why it's positive 1 centimeter water. So take a look again at the diagram. Initially, the pressure is zero, almost zero. Okay, but during inspiration, when you try to inspire at this area here, at the very rightmost, your pressure becomes negative 1 cm water. And as you can see, the lung volume tries to increase. But during expiration, your alveolar pressure increases approximately 1 centimeter water in order to push the air out. That is why the lung volume decreases. Okay. So let us now talk about your transpulmonary pressure. So your transpulmonary pressure is actually the difference between your alveolar pressure and the pleural pressure. So another term for your transpulmonary pressure is your recoil pressure. So the main purpose of your transpulmonary pressure is that it wants to collapse the lung at every respiration. So when you say respiration, this is both your inspiration and your expiration. So I hope that is clear. Okay. So let us now talk about one of the most important substance tests which are secreted in our lungs. Okay. which we call as your surfactants. So before I will discuss further on surfactant, let us first touch on a little about the principle of surface tension. So the principle of surface tension is all about how water, how water and air reacts with each other. Okay, so for water, when it comes into contact with air, usually attempts to contract. The water molecules, when it comes into contact with air, becomes contracted. So just like the raindrops, okay, you notice that when water flows down, it actually mura siya, it looks like it's contracted, right, when it goes down, okay, just like it looks like this, all right, because of the surface tension, because the water has already been in contact with the air molecules. So in our alveoli it works in the same way. In the alveoli, the um, your surface tension is responsible for forcing the air out to the bronchi, which leads to alveolar collapse. Now, the purpose of your surfactant is to prevent. Okay, it wants to reduce the surface tension rather, so that the alveoli itself will not collapse. Okay, so your surface tension, the net effect of your surface tension is to cause elastic contractile force of the entire lungs, known as your surface tension elastic force. So our surfactants in our lungs are surface active agents in the water. So as what I mentioned a while ago, they greatly reduce the surface tension of water. So our surfactants are secreted by type 2 alveolar epithelial cells, which constitute approximately 10% of the surface area of your alveoli. So our surfactants are made up of a lot of several phospholipids, proteins, and ions. But the most important components, take note, are your phospholipid DPPC or your dipalmitoyl phosphatidylcholine, your surfactant apoproteins, and your calcium ions. So it's important to note as well that our surfactants are usually secreted in our alveoli between the 6 and 7 months of gestation. Why is this important to know? Because premature infants are prone to develop respiratory distress syndrome. So just a little background, when you say premature infants, okay, the the during pregnancy, when the mother is about to give birth, ideally they should give birth by 37 weeks of pregnancy and above. But if it is less than 37 weeks, then that's what you call preterm. But especially among those less than 32 weeks, okay? So less than 32 weeks of gestation, it is significant because when they give birth at around less than 32 weeks, the pulmonary surfactants are not yet available for the newborn. So tendency when the baby comes out, when the baby tries to inhale, because there is no surfactant, the the alveoli will collapse because it already comes in contact with the air. So that is why it develops into a respiratory distress syndrome. Okay. So let us now talk about the different functions of our respiratory passageways. So for our trachea, our bronchi, and your bronchioles, so the air is distributed through these structures. So take note that around the trachea, there are multiple cartilage rings, and even in the bronchi, there are also multiple cartilage rings. The main purpose of our cartilage rings is to prevent the collapse. Okay? So cartilage rings, however, become absent when it reaches our bronchioles. Now, at the vascular wall of our bronchi and our bronchioles, its walls are composed of smooth muscle. Okay? So the main pulmonary epithelium our respiratory bronchial is mainly made up of pulmonary epithelium. So greatest resistance to the airflow is seen in our larger bronchioles and the bronchi near your trachea. Now, for the nervous and local control of our bronchiolar musculature, take note that The bronchial musculature is highly exposed to a large concentrations of our norepinephrine and our epinephrine. These are beta receptors. These are, sorry, not beta receptors, but beta adrenergic um, stimulants. All right. So beta adrenergic receptors are responsible for causing dilation of our bronchial tree. However, for parasympathetic stimulation, it does the opposite. A parasympathetic stimulation, such as the molecule your acetylcholine, will instead cause constriction of our bronchioles. So, among asthmatic patients, especially if any one of you are asthmatics, as you may have noticed, you have inhalers, okay, and your inhalers have one of its components has at the last part of the name, your salmeterol, okay, formoterol, okay, your all, those are actually your beta agonists. Okay, the main purpose is that it wants to stimulate your beta adrenergic receptors in order to cause dilation of the bronchial tree. That is why there is relief of breathing. Another molecule would be your histamine and your slow reactive substance of anaphylaxis. So these are usually released by our mast cells, and these usually happens when there are allergic reactions in our bodies. So when histamine and slow reactive substances of anaphylaxis are released, it causes constriction as well in our bronchial musculature. Okay, so let us now talk about the pulmonary circulation, pulmonary edema, and the pleural fluid. So our lung has two circulations. We have a high pressure but low flow circulation and a low pressure but high flow circulation. So, an example of your high pressure but low flow circulation is the circulation coming from your bronchial arteries. So, your bronchial arteries are responsible for supplying the systemic arterial blood towards the trachea, the bronchial tree, the pulmonary artery, and even the pulmonary vein. But for the low pressure but high flow, okay, pulmonary circulation, an example of this would be our pulmonary arteries. So they get the venous blood coming from all parts of the body to the alveolar capillaries where gas exchange happens. So take a look at this diagram. Let us first look at the heart. Okay, so for the heart, there is a systemic circulation, and then for the lungs we have a pulmonary circulation. So it is quite different because for the systemic circulation, it is just a straight flow of the blood, straight circular circulation. So remember that the oxygenated blood, as manifested by the red diagram, when it comes on the left side of the heart, it immediately goes through your aorta and then to the systemic circulation to be distributed towards the tissues and other cells in our bodies. However, after the oxygen is used in our tissues, it becomes deoxygenated and is collected via the veins. It goes to the vena cava towards the right side of the heart in order to pump the deoxygenated blood towards our lungs. Take note that in the pulmonary circulation, okay, for the pulmonary circulation, what brings the deoxygenated blood coming from the right side of the heart is actually the pulmonary arteries. Okay, when it is oxygenated in the lungs, the oxygenated blood will then be brought to the heart through the pulmonary veins. Okay, so take note of the key difference. Okay, so furthermore, the blood volume in our lungs is only approximately 450 ml or 9% of the total blood volume of the entire circulatory system. 70 ml is inside the pulmonary capillaries, and the remainder is divided equally between the pulmonary arteries and even the veins. Okay, so let us now talk about what pulmonary edema is all about. So, pulmonary edema is actually fluid, excessive fluid that is located in our pulmonary system. So, the factors which contribute to the formation of pulmonary edema are the following. It can be either due to an increased fluid filtration outside of the pulmonary capillaries, a compromised pulmonary lymphatic function, and a positive pulmonary interstitial pressure, which pushes fluid outside the capillaries. So for pulmonary edema to happen, there are the most common cause of your pulmonary edema would actually be a left-sided heart failure or a mitral valve disease. Remember, as from the diagram that which I showed earlier, the blood when it is pumped, okay, that is the oxygenated blood comes through the left side of the heart towards systemic circulation. But before the blood reaches the left side of the heart, it immediately comes from the lungs itself via the pulmonary vein. So if you have a compromised cardiac function, especially in the left side of the heart, instead of the blood being pumped outside through the aorta to the systemic circulation, the blood kind of like backflows towards the lungs. Right? So this is evident in left-sided heart failures, or especially those with the mitral valve disease. So I will not go further into a mitral valve disease. Okay. So this leads to an increase in the pulmonary venous and the pulmonary capillary pressure and flooding of interstitial spaces and our alveoli. So another cause of pulmonary edema would be damage to the pulmonary blood capillary membranes because our capillary membranes are porous membranes. Okay, so these porous membranes will increase its porosity when there are infections. Most commonly, if you have pneumonia and even noxious substances such as chlorine gas and sulfur dioxide. So especially in the elderly who might have pneumonia, you might have heard this in the news. Okay, um, even if you have pneumonia, there might be fluid in the lungs, especially if the pneumonia is severe. Okay, because this is because of the damage to the pulmon to the blood capillary membranes. Okay, so let us now talk about the pleural fluid. So, as what I initially mentioned a while ago, the pleural fluid is important because it serves like a lubricant in order to facilitate, okay, the movement of the lungs back and forth within the pleural cavity. So the pleural fluid is a mucoid fluid inside the pleural cavity. And when there is excess fluid or there is edema in the pleural cavity, this becomes later on a pleural effusion. So as you can see in the diagram, in our lung, the lung is covered by a pleura, okay, your visceral pleura. And then in between your visceral pleura and the lining of the thoracic cage, which is the parietal pleura, is a very small potential space known as your interpleural space or your pleural cavity. So this is where normally your pleural fluid resides. But in cases of infection, in cases of problems, okay, it causes edema in the pleural cavity, thus leading to a pleural effusion. So there are multiple causes of pleural effusions. It can either be because of a blockage of the lymphatic drainage from the pleural cavity. It can be cardiac failure. It can be a reduced plasma colloid osmotic pressure, as what you probably know by now, and an infection or any other cause of inflammation on the pleural surface. Okay, so for gas exchange to happen after the air goes into the alveoli, it needs to go into the pulmonary blood. So air will diffuse, oxygen will diffuse coming from the alveoli into the pulmonary blood, and carbon dioxide will diffuse into the opposite direction. Take note that air is the atmospheric air that we breathe in is composed of only 21% oxygen and 79% nitrogen. So when the total pressure of this room air that we breathe is compared at sea level, it is approximately the partial pressure of this air is approximately 760 millimeters mercury. So it is important to discuss a little about partial pressures because the partial pressure of a gas in a solution is determined not only by the concentration but also its solubility coefficient. So a partial pressure tells us how much gas is can be dissolved, because how much gas is dissolved will eventually lead to how much gas will be exchanged in our lungs. Okay, so take note that for carbon dioxide is more attracted to water molecules. Okay, so the diffusion of the gas between the alveoli and the pulmonary blood is dependent on the net diffusion. So when you say the net diffusion, this is the difference between the partial pressure. So remember that for gas to diffuse, it usually diffuses from a high concentration area to a low concentration area. So that its difference is now what we call as the net diffusion. Okay, so the respiratory unit of our lung is known as a respiratory lobule. It is composed of the respiratory bronchiole, the alveolar ducts, the atria, and the alveoli. So there are approximately 300 million alveoli in both lungs, and alveolar walls are very thin with interconnecting capillaries, as you can see here in the diagram. So the main purpose of why the alveolar walls need to be very thin with interconnecting capillaries is so that the gas exchange would be more efficient. So the factors that affect the rate of diffusion through the respiratory membrane are the following. So gas exchange can be affected based on the thickness of the membrane. So as what I just recently mentioned, the alveolar walls are very thin in order to facilitate more efficient gas exchange. Okay, so for surface area of the membrane, it can be affected by the diffusion coefficient of the gas in the substance of the membrane and the partial pressure difference of the gas between two sides of the membrane. So, your thickness, for the thickness of the membrane, this is usually evident in cases where there is edema. And for surface areas of the membrane, this is evident in cases of emphysema. Okay, so emphysema is a kind of a chronic obstructive pulmonary disease wherein the alveolar walls are destroyed. Okay, so when these walls are destroyed, the alveoli becomes very big. But in turn, even if the alveoli becomes big because of the destruction of its walls, of the walls itself, the entire surface area of the alveoli becomes affected. So it becomes a lesser surface area of the alveolar wall. So let us now go about the transport of oxygen. So your oxygen are usually transported to the tissue capillaries in combination with hemoglobin. So the partial pressure of oxygen is determined by the balance between the rate of oxygen transport to the tissue and the rate at which oxygen is used by the tissues. 97% of the oxygen is carried to the tissue in combination with hemoglobin, and 3% is transported in a dissolved state in the water of the plasma and the blood cells. So blood contains approximately around 15 grams of hemoglobin per 100 ml of blood, and each gram of hemoglobin can bind with a maximum of 1.34 ml of oxygen. Thus, if you multiply it, the maximum amount of oxygen that can be bounded to hemoglobin is approximately 20 ml. So this figure here on the right is what we call as the oxygen dissociation curve. The main purpose of this oxygen dissociation curve is that it tells us how oxygen becomes more bounded to hemoglobin as the partial pressure of oxygen increases. Okay, so take note here at the center line. Okay, at the very center line, the solid line. So take note that in the x-axis, as the partial pressure of oxygen increases, the hemoglobin, the saturation of hemoglobin being bounded to oxygen also increases up to approximately around 97% of your hemoglobin. This is important to understand because there are actually factors which we call as shifting to the right or shifting to the left. So when we say a shift to the right in your oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve, it tells you that um, oxygen is released further to the tissues themselves. Okay, so what are the factors that leads to more oxygen release? It can be because of acidosis, where there is increased hydrogen ions. It can be because of increased carbon dioxide concentration in the blood. It can be because of temperature. So if you have fever, okay, if you have fever, there will be increased release of oxygen to our tissues because the high temperature increases the metabolic rate of our cells, and our cells need more oxygen in order to function well. Okay, and the increased 2,3-DPG or biphosphoglycerate, which is prominent in states of hypoxia or low oxygen, in low oxygen states. Okay, so what is the Bohr effect? Now, the Bohr effect is a concept in the transport of oxygen wherein there is a shift to the right, or as what I mentioned, there will be more oxygen release if there will be increased blood carbon dioxide and hydrogen levels. So this is evident in our tissues. Okay, so if, for example, when you try to exercise, okay, your cells become more metabolically active, and remember that the byproduct of our metabolism would be carbon dioxide and even the hydrogen levels. So in order to give off more oxygen to our exercising cells, then the Bohr effect happens, wherein the increased blood carbon dioxide will tell actually the red blood cells to unbind the oxygen that is bounded to the hemoglobin. Okay, so how about if hemoglobin combines with carbon monoxide? Okay, especially in cases of carbon monoxide poisoning. Okay, so take note that carbon monoxide actually displaces the oxygen from hemoglobin faster because it has a binding capacity of 250 times more than that of oxygen. So the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood is normal despite a low oxygen content of the blood. So this is actually a key characteristic finding, because you expect that if something binds to hemoglobin, if there is no more oxygen bounded to hemoglobin, then you would expect that there should be low oxygen levels, correct? But how come the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood is normal, even if the oxygen content in the blood is low? This is because when we talk about partial pressure, it reflects dissolved oxygen in the plasma. Okay, it does not tell you how many oxygen is bounded to hemoglobin. So in other words, the lungs are still capable of transferring the oxygen from the alveoli to the blood, but the PO2, or the partial pressure of oxygen, thus the partial pressure of oxygen remains normal. So for those patients who have, for example, carbon monoxide poisoning, so this is evident, for example, if you say that is why a lot of, for example, those who have suicide under in parking lots in the cars, and then they usually use the exhaust fume of their cars. Okay, that's actually carbon monoxide. So when you find these patients, they actually have very cherry, what do you call this, cherry spots, okay, very bright cheeks, despite the low oxygen content, because of the carbon monoxide. So blood is still very bright red with no obvious signs of hypoxemia. But initially, when there is carbon monoxide poisoning, the person becomes disoriented and unconscious before becoming aware, okay, because of the decreased oxygen supply of the blood. So, in order to treat carbon monoxide poisoning, then you need to administer 100% of pure oxygen in order to displace carbon monoxide. Remember, you cannot just give the room air, because room air is composed of only 21% of oxygen. Okay, so let us talk about the transport of carbon dioxide, this time in our blood. So in normal conditions, an average of 4 ml per 100 ml of blood are transported from the tissues to the lungs. So an important enzyme which is responsible for catalyzing the reaction by 5,000-fold of carbon dioxide with water in the red blood cells is your enzyme known as your carbonic anhydrase. Okay, so take a look at diagram first. So after the cell um, is done with its function because metabolically active, one of its one of its wastes, okay, is carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide, when it comes into contact with the water in the red blood cell, carbon dioxide has different pathways. The first pathway that is common is that carbon dioxide can combine with water with help of carbonic anhydrase to form your carbonic acid or your H2CO3. This carbonic acid will then later on dissociate into your bicarbonate, the HCO3, and hydrogen. Okay, this bicarbonate is eventually shifted out of the red blood cell, but in turn, chloride ions will also go inside. Okay, there is an exchange between chloride and bicarbonate. This shifting of your chloride inside the cell to the bicarbonate outside the red blood cell is what you call as the chloride shift. Okay, so this is more prominent in the venous blood because, understandably, because your venous blood contains more carbon dioxide than your arterial blood. Another pathway for your carbon dioxide is that it can combine with your hemoglobin and plasma protein, so your CO2 with hemoglobin, to form your carbaminohemoglobin. So take note that carbon dioxide is mainly transported through the lungs from the different cells and tissues in our body in the form of bicarbonate. Okay, it's 70%, and then your carbamino hemoglobin is approximately 23%, and your carbon dioxide, direct carbon dioxide, is only approximately 7%. So I discussed a while ago about the Bohr effect. Now I'll tell you about the Haldane effect. So this time Haldane effect is the opposite. It's when there is oxygen. Okay, when oxygen binds to hemoglobin, it now releases more carbon dioxide from the blood. Okay, so that is different from your Bohr effect. Okay, so let us now talk about the regulation of respiration. So the respiratory center in the medulla oblongata and the pons of our brainstem are composed of different neurons. There are actually three groups of neurons. We have your dorsal respiratory group, you have your ventral respiratory group, and your pneumotaxic center. So your dorsal respiratory group generally they regulate inspiration. Your ventral respiratory group regulates expiration, and the pneumotaxic center is responsible for adjusting the rate and the depth of our breathing. So for the dorsal respiratory group, most of its neurons are located in the nucleus of the tractus solitarius or your NTS. So your nucleus tractus solitarius is actually like a common endpoint wherein the sensory signals from the peripheral chemoreceptors, the baroreceptors, the receptors in the liver, in the pancreas, the gastrointestinal tract, and the receptors in the lungs will send their signals toward the nucleus tractus solitarius, and the nucleus tractus solitarius will then tell the dorsal respiratory group to increase the inspiration. Okay? For the pneumotaxic center, its main function is to limit the inspiration because if there's too much inspiration, too much air, the pneumotaxic center will tell the brain to stop the inhalation of the oxygen. Okay, so when the signal is strong, inspiration can last only as little as 0.5 seconds. But when the signal is weak, the inspiration can continue for 5 seconds or more. For the ventral respiratory group, remember that your ventral respiratory group is responsible for expiration. Okay, but in normal quiet respiration, your ventral respiratory group is actually inactive. However, your ventral respiratory group is inactive during the normal respiration because, as if you can recall in the earlier slides, the expiration is normally because of the elastic recoil of the lungs. Okay, so there is a reflex in the respiration that regulates respiration. we term it as the Herring-Brewer reflex. So the Herring-Brewer reflex functions when the stretch receptors in the walls of the bronchi and the bronchioles transmit the signal to the vagus nerves. Remember that through the vagus nerves, it is actually parasympathetic, or it tries to um, inhibit, right? It tries to inhibit the response. So if you breathe in too much air, if the lungs and the stretch receptors senses that there is already too much air, tells it transmits those signals through the vagus nerves in order to tell, just like the pneumotaxic center, to inhibit the further respiration. Okay, so that is your Herring-Brewer reflex. So another control of the respiration is not only due to the neural control, but there is also a chemical control of respiration. It can either be because of excess carbon dioxide or excess hydrogen in the blood that directly acts on the respiratory centers. So there is actually an additional area in the neuronal area known as the chemosensitive area. So this chemosensitive area is highly sensitive to changes in the blood PCO2 or hydrogen concentration. So hydrogen is actually the direct stimuli for these neurons, but in our brain, we have what we call as the blood-brain barrier. So in the blood-brain barrier, hydrogen is not really able to pass through the blood-brain barrier. Thus, what indirectly stimulates this area is your carbon dioxide instead. So remember in the discussion earlier that carbon dioxide, when it combines with water through carbonic anhydrase, becomes carbonic acid, and your carbonic acid will then dissociate later on into bicarbonate and the hydrogen which is already in the blood. Okay, so um, that is what stimulates your chemosensitive area. Now, we also have the peripheral chemoreceptor system. So, in the peripheral chemoreceptor system, this acts through chemoreceptors, which are located outside the brain. So, they are important in detecting changes in oxygen more than carbon dioxide. So, most of your peripheral chemoreceptor systems are located in the carotid bodies. So, in the carotid bodies, mainly in our carotid arteries, and wherein from the carotid body, the afferent fibers will pass through your glossopharyngeal nerves towards your dorsal respiratory group for inspiration. Whereas there are a few peripheral chemoreceptors located this time in the aortic bodies, which are located in the arch of the aorta. So the afferent fibers will pass the signals through this time through the vagus nerve and then to the dorsal respiratory group. So there are also other factors which affect respiration. So the first would be the effect of irritant receptors in the airways. So these irritant receptors are located in the epithelium of our trachea, bronchi, and your bronchioles, and they are actually responsible for initiating the coughing and the sneezing reflexes. So if, for example, for example, those who are able to inhale smoke, okay, smoke, or for example those pepper sprays, okay, they are very irritant in our airways, so they cause bronchial constriction. So this is especially evident in asthma and emphysema, or a type of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD. Next, you have your lung J receptors. Okay, so this is your lung J receptors are found in juxtaposition. So when you say juxtaposition, they're immediately side by side. Okay, to the pulmonary capillaries. Thus, they are called as J receptors. So your lung J receptors are usually stimulated when there is engorgement of blood or when there is pulmonary edema. So if these receptors are stimulated, the patient will feel dyspnea. So when you say dyspnea, that this is a subjective feeling of breathlessness or difficulty in breathing. Okay. Next is your brain edema. So for brain edema, if there is fluid in our brain, it increases the intracranial pressure. Okay. So this increase in your intracranial pressure will actually depress your respiratory centers. Okay, because it compresses the respiratory centers. So your brain edema can be due to a lot of cases actually, but the most common of which is because of brain concussion. If there is trauma to the brain, for example, those with motor vehicular accidents or direct trauma to the brain, okay, or for example, in cases of acute stroke, okay, when acute stroke causes inflammation and therefore edema later on, it can actually depress the respiratory center. So temporarily, you can inject a hypertonic solution known as mannitol. Why? Why will you give hypertonic solution? Because this is edema. Okay, there's too much fluid. Hypertonic solution, very high um, osmolar content, especially sodium. Okay, so remember the dictum where sodium goes, water follows. So it wants to dehydrate the brain in order to bring out the water from your brain cells and be flushed to the urinary system. Okay, so that is the purpose of the mannitol. So other common factors would be overdosages, overdosing of anesthetics and narcotics. So this is actually considered to be the most prevalent cause of respiratory depression. And commonly known agents which are responsible for this are your sodium pentobarbital and your morphine. So that is why when you encounter later on in your practice morphine, okay, these are actually used commonly in pain medication to address severe pain, especially those with those cancer patients who have intractable pain, okay, unbearable pain. But the side effect is that it can cause respiratory depression. You also have periodic breathing. So periodic breathing, and a common example would be your Kane-Stokes breathing. So this is when there is waxing and waning of the respiration. So initially, the patient will breathe normally, and then afterwards there is increased breathing, and then it stops, and then increased breathing again. So it slowly waxes and wanes. Okay, so that every 40 to 60 seconds. So that is what you call as your Kane-Stokes breathing. Another would actually be sleep apnea. So, sleep apnea is in itself when you stop breathing while you're asleep. Okay, so the episodes of apnea or absent breathing usually lasts for 10 seconds or longer. So, this can either be because of obstruction of the upper airways or an impaired CNS respiratory drive. So, for sleep apnea, they're usually characterized by loud snoring and labored breathing after falling asleep. And then eventually, it is interrupted by a period with no breathing or apnea. So this results in a fragmented restless sleep because when you try to sleep already, you the period of apnea will actually increase your partial pressure of your carbon dioxide, and this actually triggers signals to the brain that you need to breathe. That is why you need to wake up. Okay, so this results in restless, fragmented sleep, multiple times that you wake up throughout the night. So this is significant because sleep apnea will usually present with excessive, okay? So not just daytime drowsiness. I have to qualify there that it has to be excessive daytime drowsiness because you are usually drowsy when you listen to lectures, especially in the morning, okay? But for excessive daytime, it has to be an excessive daytime drowsiness. Okay, so because of you lack sleep, there is increased sympathetic activity, and this increased sympathetic activity will lead to tachycardia, increased heart rate, eventually pulmonary and systemic hypertension, and also elevates your risk for cardiovascular disease. Another type of sleep apnea is your obstructive, okay, sleep apnea. So these are usually commonly seen among older but obese patients with increased fat deposition in the soft tissues of the pharynx. So this is significant because in our pharynx, when we use normally when we sleep, okay, the the pharynx are actually open enough for the air to move freely in and out. But if you are obese, if you are very fat, there will be increased fat deposition in the pharynx, thus limiting the space for air to move in and out. So eventually, when you sleep, when the control of of your respiration is very minimal during sleep, it might collapse. Okay, the pharyngeal wall will collapse, inhibiting the movement of air inside and out. So that is why it leads to sleep apnea. So obstructive sleep apnea not only seen among older and obese people, but can also be associated with those with very large lungs because again, it might obstruct your airflow and those with enlarged tonsils. So a common treatment would be what we call as uvulopalatopharyngoplasty, or you do surgery on the pharyngeal wall. Can either do tracheostomy for if the obstruction is very severe in the mouth, then you can have the airway here through your neck. Okay, and but the most most significant treatment right now is actually your CPAP, or your continuous positive airway pressure. Okay, so that's actually just a device that you attach to when you sleep, and this device gives you positive pressure, positive air pressure to keep your your pharyngeal airway open to facilitate easy access of your lungs, of your air throughout your lungs. Okay, so that's what a CPAP is. Next, we have your central sleep apnea. So when you talk about central sleep apnea, this time the drive, okay, it is the neural drive to the respiratory muscles is transiently abolished. So this can either be because of damage to the central respiratory centers or abnormalities of the respiratory neuromuscular apparatus. Okay, so I think that's it for this lecture. Um, my source is Guyton and Hall, the 14th edition. So if you have questions, feel free to message me. Thank you for listening.